Good. Okay. So that seems to have settled down, or just another sort of few more people joining. Good. So once again, welcome to the FAQs Live Special event. My name's Duncan and I'm joined by Rune here from Scaled Agile. Very much looking forward to getting into some interesting questions based on previous FAQs Live sessions that we've run over the past 2 or 3 months. Just so that you're aware, this session will be recorded. We'll sort of do a bit of Q&A. You will have the opportunity to speak if you want to, so just be aware that if you do, that will be recorded for future reference. Let me now introduce what we're going to be covering over this hour and a half. So, as I said, we've been running these FAQs Live special events, free webinars over the last few months during these interesting times. And during that time, we've noticed a few patterns with the SAFE questions that we thought might be interesting to package up and sort of try to get into a little bit of an in-depth discussion about, to sort of delve into some of the common problems, the common issues, the common things that are seen across the industry. And we're going to break this down into 2 sections. First of all, we're going to look at requirements planning and budgeting and lean budgets and lean agile principles. And to do that, we're going to explore planning, first of all, how that relates perhaps to stakeholder expectations and what the business is looking for you to answer. And then budgeting, how that's done, how it's funded, and again, how to work in SAFE, perhaps in an environment where the expectations are that budgets might be done in a slightly different way. After that, we're going to look at more of the technical elements of SAFE. So technical architecture, design at scale, those sorts of topics, starting up with the idea of upfront design and how that fits in with planning large-scale roadmaps, and then getting into the role of the architect and how they interact with teams. The way the session will work is we'll talk to the points, me and Rune will have a bit of a discussion about what we've seen, and then after each topic there will be the opportunity to do some Q&A. I would encourage you to ask your questions as soon as they occur to you in the Q&A. So in Zoom you should find the Q&A control. You can type in questions as they occur to you, and hopefully that means that when we get to the Q&A we'll have some good questions that we can get through. If you want to speak, you're more than welcome to do so as well. You can request the ability to speak again through Zoom. If perhaps you want to follow up on an answer that we give, or you have a comment about something that we're presenting. Good. So without further ado, let's dive into the first section, requirements planning, budgeting, and how these meet lean agile principles. And we'll start with a question that came up a few months ago in one of these FAQs Live webinars. And it's, I guess, a kind of a combination of several similar questions that have been asked in this area. How do you keep stakeholders happy when they want to see the annual roadmap? I'm used to seeing a nice, rigorous plan with a Gantt chart perhaps, or knowing what scope I'm going to get in over the next 12 months. How do you work with stakeholders like this, keep them happy, keep them engaged, keep them interested in situations where perhaps there are those different expectations? So I guess to cover some of the key themes that SAFE would talk about here, some of the key solutions to this, SAFE actually has a pretty comprehensive approach to planning and forecasting and keeping track of progress. Most of you are probably aware of the flagship PI planning event, which takes place typically every 12 weeks, 8 to 12 weeks, I think is the guidance, whereby a whole Agile release train, a virtual team of teams of 5 to 12 teams gets together, and they essentially try to map out what's going to happen in the next 8 to 12 weeks, so the quarterly level of planning. The result of that is a plan, and there is visual program boards to look at. You can see what is likely to be delivered. But that's not the end of the story. What then happens is that on a regular basis, on a iteration basis, typically every 1 to 2 weeks, so every 2 weeks would be typical, we're going to keep stakeholders engaged. We're going to say, this was the plan, right at the start, we anticipated these are the features that we were hoping to deliver, and here's how things are tracking. We wouldn't expect at the end of PI planning, all the things on the program board to happen exactly as mapped out. Can you imagine the probability of 12 teams, each saying, I'm going to do this here, here, and here, a couple of hundred items perhaps that are scheduled to be delivered over a 3-month period. Can you imagine the chances that everything goes exactly to plan? Of course not. You wouldn't imagine that. So there is this need to synchronize and maintain awareness. And these system demos, the end of each iteration, are key to making that work in practice. So that's the theory. Rune, have you got any practical experience about this and any sort of patterns that you might have seen in industry to sort of tackle this this question?
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks for asking. This is really a good question, and it's something that we get quite often when we go and visit enterprise as well. What I did notice in the question was that they were talking about an annual forecast, an annual roadmap. And as such, when you see it, you go in and you look at PI planning. The PI planning is typically these 8 to 12 weeks, perhaps 1 quarter, 3 months going forward. So as such, that will not help answer this question. It will give you what we have committed. So the trick is that after the PI planning, we're set out with a set of committed objectives that we're going to work on, that we're going to predictably deliver upon within that PI. And we're typically being pretty good at that, work on that predictability, is that we try to extend which one beyond the first PI, that things starts to get a bit shaky. And that's about dealing with uncertainty, it's about dealing with risk, it's about really being agile as such. When I started working with Agile, I had this conception that we're just doing work from the backlog here and there, but actually, as it turned out, and you elaborated on that yourself, planning is a well-engraved part of doing Agile. I mean, we're planning every day at the daily stand-up. We are planning every 2 weeks at iteration. We're planning every PI. But as you move further ahead in time, we're actually doing plans there as well. And that's why we have our roadmaps. So we're working with roadmaps in SAFe on different levels. When you're looking at the program level, where we have our agile release trains executing, we're actually working with a PI roadmap that will show you where are we going within the typically next 3 PIs. Now the trick is here, and that's really what's going to keep us agile, is that the first PI we have in that roadmap, that's our committed objectives, the ones that we just came out with during PI planning. Whereas the true following PIs, that's our forecast. So this is our best guess, our best intention on what we are going to deliver. And that really helps us doing planning, it helps us preparing for some of the enabler work we need to do, but it also helps us align with the business owners, with the business about what do we think that we are going to deliver, what's our forecast.
Yeah.
So when we're looking at the program level, that's really what we're looking at here.
So I guess it's about matching the predictability to the horizon, isn't it? I guess you could, have a 12-month roadmap and say this, you could sort of use the sort of program backlog and say this is exactly what you're going to do. But it would be a pretty big disadvantage if you were then locking yourself in to saying this is, even if something compelling comes up, in the next sort of PI, we're not going to change it. We're going to sort of stick to the plan, as it were. And I think, one of the things I quite like in SAFe is this idea of trying to achieve predictability. I think, the goal is to get 80% predictability, which I think in most agile software delivery, scenarios would be, you'd take that. If you could buy that now and say, we're going to be able to predict with 80% confidence what we're going to get for multiple teams working over a sort of 3-month period, I'd say that is at the sort of, mature end of sort of agile delivery. It's a pretty good thing to strive for.
If I just add something, because the predictability is really giving us the possibility not to do all these rigorous requirements, because as we're doing this light level planning and we're being predictable at the same time, we can actually show that we don't need all this level of detail. Now, if you are a business working on solutions that look more than these 3 PIs into the future, we actually have some other roadmaps that we use as well that may not be that well known, but some of the ones that we use is called, for example, the solution roadmap. So the solution roadmap is really looking at the solution that the agile release train or solution train is working on, but at a much longer horizon. We're actually looking all the way out to 1 to 3+ years in advance. Again, with the same notion that the further away you get from present time, the more coarse-grained it's going to be and the more forecast it's going to be. But we do still plan, we do still forecast very long time in advance. So it is something that we use and suggest. And I've been working on that with a couple of agile release trains that needed to go beyond this scale because they needed to coordinate with suppliers and get deliveries from them as well. So you need to be able to give some kind of forecast on that. So solution roadmaps and essentially also portfolio roadmaps is something that looks very long ahead as long as you caution yourself not to commit to it.
Well, exactly, yeah. I think there's nothing wrong with having a 12-month plan, is there? Or even a 5-year plan if you really want to. But I think, having a plan then gives you something to adapt. And I guess as you're sort of hinting at there, as you scale, there's usually more of a need to decide things a bit longer in advance. One of my favorite lean principles is decide as late as possible. And that doesn't mean decide everything at the last minute. It means work out at what point, if you don't make a decision or if you don't plan something in, you're going to compromise your ability to deliver. So as you say, if you have suppliers that need to be sort of lined up, or maybe other sort of teams where the dependencies need to be worked out, there are circumstances where some things you actually do need to map in, maybe sort of 3 months or 6 months in advance, but you're going to sort of try to keep as many options open as is possible.
Right, but some things we just need to plan for. I mean, we have our market rhythms that we need to adhere to. I mean, in Scaled Agile's case, we have a global summit coming up. Do we need to prepare in advance for that? Absolutely. Do we need to be able to agile with the content? Did we know half a year ago that we needed to focus on going remote? No, we probably didn't. That's why we needed to keep our roadmap forecasted so we can actually change once we get closer to those milestones.
Yeah, absolutely. Good. Okay. Shall we see if any questions have come in based on what we've been chatting about so far? Jess, do you want to sort of read out any questions that we have in the Q&A, and then we can respond to them?
Yep, sure. We've got 2 questions at the moment. So the first question is, there are multiple stakeholders. Is the communication different for each type of stakeholder?
Interesting. So I guess this would be something that the product manager and the product owners would be sort of thinking about. Rune, have you got any sort of thoughts on how they might sort of tailor their communication to different types of stakeholders?
Well, so what I usually recommend to the product management is to set up regular syncs, because you need to look at this 2 ways. Of course, each of the stakeholders need to be addressed in a certain way, but you want to make sure that you have alignment between them as well, so that they don't only individually understand where we're going, but collectively as well. And this is going to help us moving forward when we start prioritizing features into the PI. You want to do that together with them to get this alignment. So I would do both. As a PM, I would do individual talks with them to help them maybe find out which features are we going to try out, but I will collect them as well once in a while on cadence to do synchronization about features before PI planning. So I'll do both.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess as a product owner or a product manager, you're going to know your stakeholders, and you're going to know who's going to turn up to your system demos, or who's going to sort of turn up to those sort of synchronization events. And maybe you might know who you just need to go and talk to, maybe sort of very senior stakeholders that don't have much time, but can influence things quite considerably. You're going to ask your question, well, who are my stakeholders? Let's make a plan for the people in front of me and also manage it well.
Yeah.
Good. What's next, Jess? I think we've got a few more questions coming in.
Yeah, a few more coming in now. How important are these themes in PI planning, and is there a part of a solution roadmap?
Interesting. Yeah, do you want to take that one, Rune? You're talking about solution roadmaps.
I didn't think I heard the first part of the question.
Sorry. How important are these themes in the PI planning, and is that a part of the solution roadmap?
So themes in PI planning. How important are themes in PI planning?
Well, okay, so let me see if I get this. So theme would probably usually refer to that as the vision as such. And so the vision that is delivered by product management for the PI planning naturally need to reflect both the direction that the portfolio as such is taking, whether it's the strategic themes or it's the epics that you have planned. It needs to reflect your solution roadmap. So one thing, and I did that couple of months ago during a PI planning, I actually suggested product management to take that solution roadmap and as part of their vision, display it. Show it openly to all of the stakeholders, even all of the art participants in there. What's our plan? What's our forecast for that? So that they know when they need to make decisions, and this is really about our principle 9, decentralized decision making, they need to make decisions about things that will impact the future. Well, they should have as much insight into that future as possible to make those decisions. Now, we know it's not going to be fixed, but it's definitely going to help them. So I would definitely bring in solution roadmap into the vision presentation for the PI planning.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's certainly a theme to sort of double load the sort of word that I think crops up all over Agile, whether it's safe or any other sort of situation, having a kind of something to focus on, whether it's a vision or a goal for the sprint or an organizational objective. As an organization, we need to move from on-premise to cloud, that it all trickles down. And I think one of the things that SAFe does again quite well is there are sort of different levels of these sort of themes or visions, as you say, that they're sort of described as in the sort of framework. Because in the sort of context of what you're doing, you need to know what it's within, what the sort of context is. It's not just this story today. The whole thing sort of builds up into a feature and into a sort of broader sort of theme. And I think it always helps to know what you're trying to achieve at that sort of larger scale. Good. Okay. Do we have any more questions, Jess?
We do. I'm just going to read these three out all together because they could be linked. But what do you use as a solution level for capability? What do you use as portfolio level for epics? And how do you maintain traceability?
Interesting. Okay. So I guess this, what do you use at the sort of solution level for, I guess, the different types of requirements? Is this so capabilities, epics, and the traceability between a capability and epic? Yeah. What do you think about that, Reem?
So when we're looking at the solution level, we're looking at a single solution. I would typically look at the epics coming in there, just as we do at the portfolio level roadmap. So we're having these larger chunks of works that are beyond a single PI and getting those in there. So definitely epics that are impacting the solution. That's primarily what I would focus on here.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the sort of the different sort of types of requirements, I think, sort of map quite sort of clearly, don't they, in sort of in SAFe. So if you're using epics, I think epics are kind of a budgeting construct. If something is over a certain level of capitalization and sort of requires a certain resource, it might need to go through the epic process. I think epic in SAFe has a particular meaning which is much more significant than in other sort of agile frameworks. I think in many agile frameworks, epic simply means bigger than a single sprint, whereas in SAFe it's very akin to a kind of a capitalized project. We need to sort of, be sort of quite sort of clear and diligent about whether we sort of fund it. And that can then be broken down into either capabilities at the solution level or maybe directly into features. And I guess that traceability is maintained by the hierarchy of the requirements that you sort of have in that sort of way. So you can sort of start with an epic and you can look at that epic and say, well, 3 of the features are being done by that agile release train and 6 are being done by that one over there. Here's how it's all mapping together. And I guess it's all in the implementation then, what tools you're using to sort of trace where the requirements are. But I think it's a good question. If you're sort of doing something big, you need to have that traceability and be able to look at it and understand what the situation is, I would say. Good. Okay. Good. Okay. I think is that all the questions we have in that first Q&A, Jess? Yep.
This is all the questions so far.
Great, good stuff. Let's move on to the next topic then. So this, again, was a question that came up a little while ago in one of the previous sessions. What do you do if you're required to provide forecasts for the whole year? So we've certainly had many clients like this where the deal is, once a year or maybe as a kind of a specific initiative, as new work is funded, you've got to go to the board, you've got to go to the sponsors, you've got to go to some sort of committee and say, well, this is the project that we're planning. We're going to do this project for 4 months and this project for 8 months. In order to get the money, in order to get approval and get funding, the ability to actually get started, we may need to demonstrate what we're going to get. This is the forecast, this is the scope. A little bit, very connected to that sort of first question actually about sort of providing a 12-month roadmap, but I guess more sort of specific to a project. In order to sort of get started with this piece of work, we need a plan, we need to know what's in scope, we need to know when it's going to be delivered, and maybe even sort of forecasting that at the start of a year. So this is, I guess what you describe as a sort of traditional project-based funding. And if you sort of look into the sort of portfolio level of SAFe, you'll find a different approach is advocated, this idea of value stream funding. So rather than funding or allocating funding to specific projects or initiatives, we're funding value streams, which are then implemented by agile release trains, one or more of those, in such a way that we're sort of maintaining a sort of steady level of funding for a particular stream of work. What this then means is that the product manager is able to make decisions. if the product manager planned in a feature for the first program increment and then it overruns or it takes longer than expected, that product manager has the autonomy to decide, well, what should I do? Do I cut it short? Do I delay other features? But there's no rebudgeting required. There's no needs to go groveling to the sort of sponsor or to the sort of committee that approves these sorts of things and say, well, sorry, it was late. It's an IT project. It's never happened before, but goodness me, it's taken longer than we expected. Can I have some more money? We're going to get rid of that overhead, but maintaining that diligence, maintaining that rigor in that we have a product manager who is empowered to make decisions, but accountable for the results. It is then also possible to review these funding streams. These budget allocations may be adjusted on a sort of a regular sort of basis, on a sort of long-term sort of basis. So there are still those checks and balances. There's still that rigor. If you're funding work, if you're a financial controller, if you're essentially accountable for the way that budgets are spent and allocated, there is still control. There is still the ability to adjust, but it just avoids these startup costs that can often be very sort of difficult to sort of work with when it comes to the overheads of allocating budgets and the need, therefore, to make plans at the start of the year. Anything to add there, Rune? Any sort of thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I mean, there are so many facets to that question that it will be hard for me to do justice in this time frame here. I'll just say, and I'm not trying to do a commercial here, we just last week released our latest version of LPM, which actually goes into detail.
So that's lean portfolio management, is that?
Yeah, lean portfolio management, about value stream funding, about how you allocate funds, how you adjust your funds, how you use your epic. So there's a lot of stuff in there that is highly recommendable. You're actually following with a toolkit we have you can use together with your business stakeholders in the enterprise to actually get a good kickstart into the LPM journey. So with that being said, as you say, we're trying to move towards funding value streams, and I've looked at some of the case studies. I haven't seen that many, but the ones that are moving there, you're really seeing a shift in their ability to be agile at an organizational level. Whereas you've seen mostly, you will see agile release trains and solution trains being started, and you will see IT, even with some business in this, actually start to be very agile, start using DevOps and all these kind of things. But you're seeing the portfolio perhaps lagging a bit behind because previously we had, as part of our implementation roadmap, suggested that LPM, lean portfolio management, is something you do at the end. Now we've seen that getting our portfolio aligned already from the beginning of the journey, so actually starting looking at lean portfolio management at the very beginning, might be a better approach. So we can actually do a double track, looking at the release trains and looking at our funding model for our value streams. The thing is also here that whereas you normally would fund your projects, here you're funding value streams, and you're then having all these epics going in there. Some of these epics would have been approved by lean portfolio management, and you will go and implement them in its full, whereas some of them will have minimal viable products, small subsets of that epic that will try to prove or disprove our hypothesis about the entire epic. And the idea here is that if you have an initiative, if you have an epic, which will cost you 100 million to implement, do you want to put all that money in there right now? Or do you want to make a smaller part of your product, this MVP, go out and test it, maybe for 5 million, see if it actually gives you the feedback and the metric that you wish to have, that you prove your hypothesis, and if it does, you move forward. So not only are we funding value streams, we're also trying to fund smaller experiments before actually going all in on these major initiatives, the biggest one. And then, as you said about the funding model, how do you address the risk? So we are working with something we call guardrails that we put in place for the portfolio to say, okay, when do we actually need to consider this being a portfolio concern? We need to have our business owners involved in this. We need to set some budgetary guidelines for how big can EPIC be before it actually becomes a portfolio concern, and so on. So we are actually putting in some different rules in these guardrails to help us make the right adjustments.
Yeah, interesting stuff. I think there's a lot of really good stuff in the sort of the sort of portfolio sort of part of SAFe. I think we were sort of talking before, weren't we, about how it's one of the areas of SAFe which is least implemented. You know, I think we've both struggled to come up with case studies of where all the sort of, you know, the way that it's sort of done in the sort of documentation, the way that it's sort of mapped out is you know, fully formed and fully sort of implemented in industry. You know, ask us for a scenario on PI planning, and you know, we could both sort of come up with half a dozen, you know, good relevant examples. But this is one of those areas where either it's kind of done just in a company's own way, you know. So I think open-ended funding is relatively common. You know, it's not uncommon for a product owner or a product manager to have a team or a program, and that is an ongoing sort of funded sort of stream. But getting into the sort of, you know, the way that budgets can be sort of reviewed and allocated and, you know, decided on at the beginning, and as you say, you know, optimized in such a way that you're trying to sort of get good data before you sort of make further decisions. I think there's quite a lot here that, you know, sort of is you know, worth getting into. It's worth sort of investigating.
Yeah, and I can just a small add-on. So as you say, it's been more looked at more in theory as in practical. But what we're seeing here, and you can see that from the presentations we get for the various summits that we hold, is that you're actually seeing more and more companies coming in here from a SAFe applied point of view, saying, okay, we actually tried to do this. We made some mistakes along the road, but we tried to put in lean budgeting. We tried to put in guardrails. So we're seeing more and more of this come up.
Yeah, absolutely. Good. Okay. Should we see if we have any questions accrued on this topic then? Jess, what do we have in the Q&A?
Yep, we have some questions. So when a PM is managing multiple ARTs, how do you manage accountability with underlying PO and synchronization? Part of this is giving PO the room to develop their own agile learning and growth.
Interesting. Yeah. So there's always a bit of a sort of trade-off, isn't there, about, you know, who makes decisions, how much decision making can be decentralized. So I guess if a product manager is managing multiple agile release trains, then that, you know, implies that it's quite a big thing. And how much autonomy do you give to the individual product owners? What are your thoughts on that, Reid?
Yeah. So let me see if I heard correct, because I heard multiple agile release trains here. Right.
Yeah. So I guess that maybe they have a solution train, perhaps.
Yeah. So that's one. First of all, a product manager, that's a full-time position.
Mm-hmm.
One art, one product manager. Maybe sometimes even more product managers, because it's actually quite a big job to, as you said earlier, 12 teams. That's a lot of people here. Now, if you're talking multiple agile release train working on the same solution, that's where we put in the concept of a solution train typically. So if you have like 6, 7 agile release trains working on the same solution, each of those agile release trains will have their own product manager, but you will have a solution manager facilitating these PMs from a solution train point of view. So actually making sure that we are aligned, that the individual arts are delivering, that we are synchronizing the way that we're delivering features in that sense. So this is why you're putting in the solution train construct to do this kind of synchronization and collaboration between the different arts, so we stay in sync.
Yeah, I guess in some ways there's two parts to this question. One is the mechanics of it. How do you organize? If you have multiple agile release trains, how do you put the systems in place so that you have maybe a solution manager working with product managers, maybe even having multiple product managers? And I think, yeah, that's you know, a sort of key part of it to make it work well. You've got to have the time, you've got to have the bandwidth, the capacity to do a good job. I guess maybe the second part of this question, just by the way, Rune, you can, if you open up the Q&A, you can read the text of the questions as well, just to get into the detail of it. I think one of the sort of questions here is about how to give the product owner the room to develop their own agile learning and growth. And I guess this sort of ties back to the sort of things we were talking about, vision, you know, having at the sort of solution level, having a vision, this is what we're trying to do overall, and, you know, giving enough leeway for the individual product managers and then down to the individual product owners. A product owner would know this is what we're trying to achieve in the sort of long term at the sort of large scale. This is the features or the set of features that I've been, you know, I've worked with my product manager to get. I then should have a reasonable amount of autonomy in terms of exactly the, you know, the detail of the requirements, how it all sort of works and how it fits together. And I think if I was a product manager, I would be looking to sort of draw out those broad themes, that broad vision, be very specific about what exactly was wanted if necessary. If there are certain things that must be true, you make sure that you identify those and then give as much decision making as possible to the product owners to get into the detail and implement it, knowing the context of what they're working in. Would you agree?
Yeah, so the answer to this question, I'm gonna reuse that when we talk about architecture later on, because that's closely related.
Yeah.
So this is decentralization at its core. You know, this is the tipping scale. How much can who decide? And of course, on a paper is that you have your PM that's market focused, you have your PO that's team focused, but you need to have some kind of you need to have a lot of collaboration between the two. And you don't want to have the POs running to the PM all the time to ask questions, because you're going to get your delays in that way. So a very practical tool that I like to use both for POs and for Scrum Masters for that sense, and for architects that I'll show later on, is what I call a delegation board. So delegation board, really simple, is talking about you having a number of decisions that you will face, typically for a PO. The POs will come up with those decisions themselves. Then you will have a discussion with your PM. And this delegation board is giving you seven different grades of delegation, from PM decides everything to PO decides everything. And then you have this scale in between where the PO will decide more and more, will still inform the PM. And what you do is that on a cadence, typically when you're having your PO syncs, new questions might come up, is who decides about this? How can we decide about this? And you go and you have a discussion, where in this delegation scale are you actually now? So can we make a decision here? Yes, you can. Do I need to inform the PM that I did it? Yes, you must. And as time progresses, you will see the level of delegation will actually shift to a higher level, but it's not either or. You're having a whole scale to do it with, and that will work for POs, Scrum Master, architects alike, as long as it's visible and you do it collaboratively within your group.
Yeah, that's a nice approach, and then at least people understand, you know, what the parameters are. You know, what can I decide? What do I need to escalate to? I think understanding that is always key. Good. Okay. What's next, Jess?
Are there other funding streams other than operational and development streams used in practice?
Interesting question. So these sort of funding streams are applied to the sort of agile release trains. Are you aware of? I'm certainly aware of operational and development funding streams. Reen, are you aware of any others?
Not to my knowledge. So again, funding in SAFE is for development value stream. We don't talk about funding the operational value stream as such. So portfolio management is about managing the portfolio and the funding for the development value stream part of it. I'm not aware, at least in the SAFE context, of other ways of doing it.
Yeah. Do feel free to post a follow-up on that, but yeah, I don't think we're aware of any other types of funding streams, certainly not in the sort of core framework, but do post a follow-up if you have a particular scenario in mind in that question. What's next then, Jess?
An annual roadmap was mentioned, but how high, at a high level, do you estimate what functionality is possible that is defined timeframe as a forecast? Good,
interesting. So we're talking about annual roadmaps. And we're sort of, trying to understand the level at which we're going to estimate functionality, as I guess as a function of the time frame in the sort of forecast. So a 12-month sort of roadmap might be sort of translated into one of these solution backlogs. That's the sort of the anticipated future content of PIs. But how does that? I guess the question is, how do you what level of detail is there as a function of where it is in the roadmap? So things in the next PI compared with things that are not planned for the next 12 months.
Right. So the solution roadmap, again, it goes 1 to 3+ years in advance, and the further out in the future you go, the more coarse-grained it is. But the roadmap is filled with epics, and each of the epics will, as part of going through the portfolio Kanban, will get some kind of estimation. Now we know estimation. If we want to get a very, very fine level of detail, we need to spend enormous time on doing that and doing breakdowns. We don't want to do that. We don't want to give it an estimate. We know estimates are going to be wrong, and this is why for the epics in the portfolio roadmap, or epics as such, we're working with ranges. So we're working with ranges, saying, and this is dependent on the company and situation you're in, but you'll look at a scale, saying, okay, so a small epic may be between 100 and 300,000, and extra large could be between 10 and 100 million. As such. So you're working with ranges, you're working with guesses, and then you'll be able to map out, okay, we have a guess for the next year for these 3 epics, it's going to land between 7 and 15 million.
Yeah. So distilling the question down again, I guess it's all about, we have features, or we have, epics in the plan. I guess we're all fairly familiar with how we might estimate and plan an individual program increments. The teams will break them down into stories. They'll estimate those in story points. I guess the question is, how do you sort of scale it up? How do you look at the plan for the next 12 months and accepting the fact that it is just a provisional plan, especially outside of the current program increment? What kind of techniques might be used to try to forecast? Here's what we'd like to do over the next 12 months. What kind of techniques might we use to actually make those predictions and make those forecasts?
Right. So I'll try to put a two-way answer to this. So first of all, I think the way we work with it here is typically we're doing t-shirts. You're trying to find t-shirt size again from small to extra large, and then you typically based on historical data will try to see, okay, so what are these 4 or 5 ranges that we need to work within? What are the typical sizes we're talking about? So again, in the beginning, when you don't have anything, you're going to do a best guess. But as you progress in your journey, you will be better and better at guessing because you will have other epics to compare to. So it will be more accurate within these ranges in t-shirt size. So that's really how we do it. Then we're also looking at, if we talk about funding of value streams and looking at all the work coming in, you might be aware that we're using or promoting participatory budgeting within the framework at portfolio level, trying to get all of our stakeholders in, looking at all the epics, looking at our funding model and see what we can actually do, actually having a discussion, collaboration about these epics. Do we need to fund them? Do we need to fund them fully? Can we do parts of it? So on and so forth. So participatory budgeting and using scaling t-shirt size, applying to your context is probably what I'm going to suggest.
Yeah, good. So participatory budgeting, I guess you could get those stakeholders together, the people that are looking for that 12-month time frame, that sort of forecast, and you could, I guess, sort of show, what information do we have? We've got some initial sizes. We're going to sort of invest a bit of time and effort into t-shirt sizing the sort of features and the epics, and you can sort of map things out and maybe sort of play with a few different options. We could do this, or this, or we could maybe adjust it like this. And I guess the participatory nature of it means that people are involved, and in that way they're sort of maybe a bit more invested in how it's all going to work. Good. Okay. What's next, Jess?
We have some advice that people are asking about. So the biggest challenge we have is defining the value streams. Any advice on where I could go to get some best practice? Right.
Okay. So I'll give it a simple answer. So best practice is by far using the value stream and art identification workshop. It's a workshop we have had for a very long time and that we have available to all of our SPCs. And that workshop is really about finding out what's your operational value streams, how does the company actually make money, finding the system that supports how our company makes money, and then finding the people, finding how they're working together in order to find, ideate, create solutions for these systems, and then at the very end, turn these development value streams into agile release trains or solution trains. That is the best practice. It's a pretty tough workshop. All of the expertise will go through it in the implementing course, but we do highly suggest that you link up with somebody who have at least some experience within the fields when you go and apply it. It can be a bit tricky sometimes, especially where you have larger organizations, but definitely that toolkit, that is worth gold in my opinion.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're right to sort of try to get a bit of practical experience, and sometimes even it helps to get a bit of an external look. There's always a few different ways that you can cut it, a few different options. I remember, sort of several times, especially when you're sort of, launching an agile release train, in the sort of run up to it, in the sort of 4 to 6 weeks before that sort of big, sort of PI planning session, you'll be talking with the sort of senior leadership team. Well, how are we going to cut it? Are we going to have the teams like this, or like this? There are options here or there. And I think it just helps to, to have somebody to help, with that, and get some expertise to sort of help, look through the different options, look through the potential benefits and trade-offs that you'll be sort of looking into.
Yeah. And then I'll just put a final twist on that. Once you've done it, and you put your arts into place, recognize that you're not going to be right the first time. It's not going to be perfect the first time. So this is why we actually advocate that you run this workshop multiple times, and you may have made some compromises early that you need to fix. Maybe you have launched more arts, and they're now having dependencies between each other. So rerunning this workshop is actually part of accelerating your organizational agility. So being able to change the organizational setup you have in the virtual organization that art is really a strength within SAFe, as I see it.
I think it's a great point. Yeah, because then you're not sort of worried about the fact that have we got it right? We can't launch the agile release train until we're sure we've got it right. If you take away that that sort of concern, and so just like agile principles in general, let's get a good plan together. Let's execute it. Let's inspect and adapt. Let's sort of adjust it based on the feedback that we can see. You'll probably learn a lot in that sort of those first few weeks or that sort of first program increments than you would trying to sort of predict or anticipate what might go on. Good. Okay. Anything else in the Q&A, Jess?
Yep, more advice being asked. So do you have any advice around value streams and a fit of objective and key results?
OKRs. Yeah. How do you sort of see those fitting in with value streams, Rune?
Well, so happy for that question because that's actually something we brought into the framework here with our recent release. So we use OKRs in what we call our strategic themes. So the strategic themes are really what link our whole portfolio to our enterprise strategy. And as a formulation of these strategic themes, these differentiators that we actually use OKRs for that. So this is something that if you want to learn more about how we use the OKRs, go in and take a read about that in the strategic themes article on the framework.
Great stuff. Good. I think there's just one clarification in the Q&A as well. So the art identification workshop, did I capture the correct name for that workshop? So this is the sort of value stream mapping sort of exercise that you were talking about, Rune. Is that the right term for it?
Oh, let me see. You want me to give the exact right one. So I think I probably have a copy of it lying here.
Is it the value stream mapping workshop? Just from memory?
An art identification workshop.
Right, yeah. I guess that sort of feeds in from sort of value stream mapping, doesn't it? You're sort of working out where the value streams are in your organization, and you're sort of designing an art around it.
It's a bit of a twist to that because when you're going into mapping, so we're talking about the value stream exercise. We're looking at a more higher level. When we're talking about mapping each of the small individual steps, we're moving more into our what we call our DevOps part, where we actually go in and find all the small nitty-gritty steps that you're taking and all the handoffs and the lead time, how you can improve that, and those kind of things. So that's a little bit of separate, but the other one, the value stream and identification workshop, that's the one you're going to be looking for.
Great, good stuff. Good. Okay. Well, we're halfway through the session and 2 minutes ahead of schedule, so that's good for the sort of timings. So let's move on now to the second part, and we're going to shift away from requirements and budgets and think more about the technology, how to implement all of these great ideas that our product managers have been sort of clamoring to get us done. And the first question to sort of tackle comes again from a sort of question we had in one of these previous FAQs Live sort of sessions, talking about the trade-off between upfront architecture and the need to get started. Is there a risk of accumulating technical debt without upfront architecture? So there is this desire, this sort of need to get started, and Agile, the Scaled Agile Framework says, don't spend 6 months getting the architecture perfect, or sort of having that big upfront sort of architecture and design. Is there a risk then that we're going to throw ourselves headfirst into just writing code and not thinking about the future, developing ourselves into all sorts of technical corners and not sort of having it scale? And there is certainly the danger, if you do take that approach, if there is no thought about architecture, that initially the sort of first sort of few weeks are spent writing features, all of that sort of time is being used to sort of productively sort of get code out and get it shipped. Without thought to architecture, without sort of a considered approach, without a sort of a considered way of managing and sort of thinking about the future, before long you're going to be spending more time fixing problems, refactoring, and mitigating the fact that if you change one thing over here, 10 things change all over there. Then you are going to be sort of actually sort of writing the code itself. So there is certainly a risk of this. Accumulating technical debt is something that all software engineering sort of practices should be worried about and thinking about, whether it's 2 or 3 people writing the code or 2,000 or 3,000 people writing the code. There is always that sort of risk of accumulating technical debt. And I guess what we're talking about here is we're not talking about eliminating upfront architecture. We're talking about emergent design, rather than sort of big design upfront where you can't do anything at all before you've completed the technical architecture and design and built a solid platform. That's a phrase I often hear. We can't write the code until we have a solid platform to build on. I think the idea of emergent design is that we use what we would define in SAFe as enablers, and enablers can exist at all sorts of different levels, from the story level all the way up to the epic level, I sort of believe. We're going to sort of use those enablers to make this space to think carefully about the design and the architecture. And it might be, if it's a greenfield project, if it's a brand new system that we've never done before, it might well be that for the first few iterations, or maybe even the first program increments entirely, most of the time is spent on enablers, and I guess this would be less the case if it was a steady platform and you had an existing system. But there is certainly a sort of situation where a lot of the efforts up front might be building out the architecture, thinking about the designs, maybe maintaining multiple different design options to sort of get going. But even so, having a little bit of business-facing functionality built into those, even those sort of early iterations. So I think one of the principles is don't spend the whole time just on the platform. Get something that works, because having something to look at and feedback on is a pretty critical part of the picture. If you're going 3 months, 6 months with nothing to see, the big risk there is you get there, you show the first feature, and the business says, well, that's completely out of what we had in mind. That's not what we were hoping for at all. So so mitigating that requirements risk, as well as giving attention to the technology risk, I think is one of the sort of themes that leads to success in this approach. What are your thoughts on that then, Reem?
I'm gonna take a different perspective, but it's really important. So I'm gonna go back to a little phrase that we tend to use. It's called deliver value in the shortest sustainable lead time. That's what it's about. And I've been so fortunate in 2 of the transformations I've worked in. I've worked with complete greenfield technologies, both on SAP, but also on homemade database systems and those kind of things. And in both scenarios, there were existing business application running where we needed to do a full greenfield redesign of how it worked. One of the cases was simply because, well, the database that was being decommissioned. There was no more support. The support cost would simply be extremely high to have that maintained. So the idea here was that we needed to make sure that the business was running. So this was a BI system where we needed to continually give business intelligence to the business, while at the same time building up a whole new infrastructure. And the way we wanted to do this was really, as you explained here, so we're maintaining the existing platform, and then we're trying to recreate part of that platform as enablers on the new environment. But how do we know it's working? How do we know that the reports that we're supplying the business for them to, well, have the operational value stream actually be operational is working? So we took it bit by bit and took it apart, took a little bit of enablers. So what enabler do we need to have this report running? Then you implement it. Then you implement the report. You see if it's working. You do a cross-check through your system demos with your business owners. They give you some feedback. You do a bit of tweaking. You get that running. You take the next part. You take the next part. So you're slowly decomposing a working solution and bringing it over to an entirely new one while the business is running. And that was an eye-opener, because before we started to do this, there was a whole project, I think, planned for 2 to 3 years to set up the entire infrastructure and then do a migration of all the business thing. And we're looking into 3 years into the future, we're looking at humongous support cost of the existing solution. But by slowly taking it apart, you could actually lower the support cost on the legacy solutions, because we're shutting down services a bit at the time. So for me, again, we're trying to do the best for the business, and we want to validate as we go along, because it's greenfield, it's new technology, it's innovative. We really need to go this step by step.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the sort of themes that comes up here, especially for that particular sort of scenario, the big re-platforming scenario, the sort of lift and shift, make the new system do exactly what the old system did. The database is going out of commission. That is always a big project, isn't it? That's always going to be a multi-year, 1 year, 2 year sort of type of thing. And I think it's just about getting the engineers together and maybe getting a little bit creative about how you could get some early value, and as you say, get some early validation. There's a case of of this we saw a few years ago in an e-commerce sort of situation. So, online retailer needed to replace their entire content management system. They'd built it from scratch, and it got to the stage where it was just unmaintainable. And the whole thing was going to take at least 18 months, but they realized that they could get some early value by delivering something that marketing were really sort of clamoring for. So that the old system wouldn't let marketing change text on a certain part of the site without a full production release. And that would take a week, and it'd be a big overhead. So within the sort of first month, I think, of this new sort of initiative, we had the new platform running, serving just a tiny little bit of content through the old platform that let marketing finally be able to control this little bit of area of the site that otherwise would have had a big overhead and a big sort of cost to do it. And then gradually over the sort of 18 months, we sort of slowly migrated sort of bit by bit, sort of piece by piece. And it did two things. First of all, it de-risked the technology. We had the new system running in production, getting sort of real traffic. And at the same time, we had value being delivered. We weren't having to wait all that time to sort of get some value out of the system. I like the phrase you used there, sort of the shortest sustainable lead time. I think that's a desire, that's an aim. If you're sort of building a sort of software delivery capability, having a short lead time is good, but if it's unsustainable, then it's hopeless. You're going to be sort of right back into that sort of situation over here, where it's good at first, but before too long, you got into a bad situation. Good. Okay. Shall we see if any questions are coming through on this this sort of topic so far? Jess, do we have anything in the Q&A?
We do. We have one on technical debts. They are asking, how much is a good percentage in a PI from your experience of an overall sprint to keep it manageable in a growth, sustain, and harvest environment?
Wow, this is a pretty sort of broad question. I guess this depends a huge amount on where you are today. What is your legacy issue? What system are you running? What are your constraints? How easy is it for you to get a sort of release into production? Is it automated for the testing, the deployment? What's the sort of current situation? I think that percentage is going to vary hugely depending on where you're starting from. Rune, have you got any sort of cases you'd like to sort of bring to that, or any observations?
I've tried a little bit of both here. I usually say, if you don't measure it, you won't know. So I was in a situation where we're starting up Agile release train, and we needed to fix some of this technical debt in here. So we set out, okay, what are we going to do? Well, set aside 20% to remove the technical debt. But that guardrail we put up was not supposed to be hard. It was our guess, that was our estimate, but we wanted to measure it PI by PI by PI and then try to adjust it accordingly. And even through the first PI, when we did the inspect on this, we had used 45% on actually removing technical debt because that was what was required. We took that percentage, we had a discussion with our business owner saying, well, we're going to deliver less features to you, no matter what. And they're like, oh, what do you mean? Well, so if you put a lot of features to us and not giving us the opportunity to remove technical debt, the technical debt is going to inhibit us to create the features. But if you get us extra time to remove the technical debt, well, you're still going to get less features now, but moving forward, our velocity is going to improve. So it's this knob that you need to turn, and the only way you can do that is get some measurements, share those results with those people that are participating in giving you your existence to live as an art, or the features you're delivering, and have that dialogue. And having some short-term and especially some long-term goals is important here, but do the measurements. And we simply did it just counting the number of story points that we were spending on technical debt versus that we did a new implementation and showing that graph. It was as simple as that, and then a good dialogue.
Yeah, interesting. I guess there's sort of a two-pronged attack you can sort of take there. If you have an issue with technical debt, on the one hand, as you say, you can ring fence a bit of time. You can do a bit of capacity allocation, 20% for technical debt. And I guess at the same time, you can try and help product owners and product managers evaluate the value of these enablers alongside the features. So this feature here, that's going to give us an uptick in sales of 0.2%. Our estimate is that's what our sort of a hypothesis might be. This one over here is an enabler that's going to reduce the cost of making a release from 2 weeks of manual hard work to sort of half an hour pressing a button and sort of deploying in that sort of way. Here's the cost of each one. Here's how our estimate for how long each is going to take. And you can then sort of start to evaluate the two alongside each other. I think one of the sort of key things in the backlogs at all levels of SAFe is that the technical things, the enablers, are in the same backlog as the business facing things, the stories and the features. And I think, I guess the relationship between sort of technology and the business, the relationship between agile teams and architects alongside product owners and product managers is they need to be able to communicate effectively so that the product management and the product ownership can evaluate the value of doing those and prioritizing those enablers to pay off technical debt, to invest in the platform, to invest in the continuous delivery pipeline, and all of those good things.
Yeah, so Duncan, for future sessions like this, I can highly recommend. So one of the topics I find very interesting, that's the collaboration in the art team between the RTE, the system architects, and the PM, because just as your agile teams need to work together, these guys, or girls for that matter, needs to work together as a team as well and balance all of these things. It's just as important, probably even more important, because they have an art level responsibility.
Good stuff. Good. Okay. Any more questions, Jess, in the chat?
Yep, a few more coming through. What are key reports for management, and who needs to provide them?
Interesting. Presumably within a sort of technical debt or sort of system architecture type context. So, what would you expect to see, Rune, if you're a member of the sort of senior leadership team, management, and you want to sort of get a report on the state of technical debt or what's sort of coming in and how things are progressing? What kind of things would you look at?
Yeah, so I'm usually pretty low practical about this. So the one metric I mentioned before, how much of my velocity is going into, or how much of my capacity is going into doing feature development versus tech debt. And again, if you have some kind of ALM tool, that will be a simple thing just to mark it in a checkbox, whether it's one thing or the other. I really like that because that's enlightening to show them how much of our entire capacity is actually being used to deliver new stuff to the business. And then always following up with, but we can improve it in this way, and then already be able to present your neighbors. So that's one thing. I like another one that I used in one of my first arts. We had this huge poster in the art, and every time anybody in the art were being inhibited of moving forward doing their code because of technical debt, they did a stroke. And then PI by PI, we counted the strokes just to see. Our goal was really simple. Each and every PI, we needed to have less of these. Started out, I think, with 118 or 119 or something like that, and then slowly getting it down and down. Sometimes you'll see a peak up because you needed that special delivery and you'll introduce more tech debt. Very simple graph, but it's including all the people from the art and being able to do it. It's low practical, it's easy to do. So again, get the information from those who have it, and that's really the people who are developing.
That's a nice idea. It reminds me of some of the things I've done with teams around tracking waste. Anything slows you down, make a note of it, track it, and then you can review it at the end of the sort of cycle. Good. Okay. And I think there's a question here in the sort of chat as well, more of a sort of statement or sort of summary. In simple terms, we are saying that there is a trade-off between the PM and the PO, and they need to decide what's best.
So I would say it's a trade-off typically between the PM and the system architect. Of course, the PO have constant authority over the team backlog and can, if he chooses to do so, remove technical debt. That's within his authority to do it. But if you're looking at the bigger picture, if you're looking at the bigger things, it's really between the system architect and the PM, the PM is looking at prioritizing the features, the system architect is looking at prioritizing the enablers. How do we intermix that afterwards to that degree? So as I see it, it's the system architect and PM that needs to do this.
Stuff. Good. Okay. So on to the last question then. So this was a question that again sort of came in a sort of previous session, and this is all about the relationship, pretty much as you're sort of just leading into there, Rune. So that's a very nice link. What's the relationship between architects and the teams in SAFe? So the question came: how do the architect roles work, and is there space for the teams to practice emergent architecture? I think I understand what you're sort of talking about earlier when we were talking about the product owners and product managers. The sort of answer you gave there about, you know, do the product managers and define things at the sort of high level? Is there space for the product owners to have their sort of autonomy around the requirements? So I guess this is a kind of a similar question, but this time in a technology space, isn't it? So we have these sort of roles defined. You know, these are the sort of safe technical roles, I guess, in that sort of technical track within SAFe. Agile teams are doing the work sort of day to day. They're working, you know, on a sort of technical level. They're sort of mentored by program architects and engineers, and through to solution architects, and all the way up to enterprise architects. Of course, not all sort of cases are all these roles in place, but I guess there is a hierarchy in SAFe. But hopefully that doesn't mean that it's about giving orders and telling people what to do. Hopefully it's more around mentoring and the premise that if we can decentralize the decision, then we hope we can. You know, that's the objective. If you're the enterprise architect, you don't want to be messing around telling each developer, right, this is exactly how to sort of solve this particular problem. You want to lay out some broad sort of, sort of technical, I guess, sort of areas and some sort of technical sort of practices, work with teams, work and mentor teams to sort of make effective decisions. I guess there is a role here for coordinating across multiple teams. You don't want to have, hundreds of teams all doing it slightly differently, and that leads to a bit of a headache in terms of licenses and other sort of costs and other sort of practicalities in that sort of area. But hopefully what this means is that the people on the ground doing the work have as much autonomy and leeway as makes practical sense within the particular constraints of the sort of technical stack. Would you agree, Rune?
I will agree, and I will say that the more and more I work with SAFe, so I will say that the architects that you show here, they're really starting to emerge as the new lean agile leaders. So they have to embrace so many of the SAFe principles that we have in here. We're talking about principle 3 about exploring alternatives. How can you explore alternatives if you're not given the freedom to do so? We're talking about fast learning cycles, how we can actually make sure that the people in the teams can make decisions and really fast find out whether they're going in the right direction or not. And in order to actually support these, you need decentralized decision making at the same time. So this is maybe something that again, just like product managers, it hadn't been normal to do this, but it's absolutely essential to get it working. There's a few twists to this. I really like this picture you put in here, but what you see is that within the agile team, either you typically have some kind of, whether it's an application architect or some kind of very technical savvy person who will make some fast decisions on architecture. So this is really where the emergent architecture come out. How can you let them do this? And what I've seen work quite well is especially between the system architects and those, whether we call them architects or not, within the agile teams, forming either communities of practice or small working groups, and on cadence going in here and reviewing what's our vision, what's our framing of the architecture. That's really what's setting the big boundaries. We can't go off and let the teams decide 4 different cloud architectures to use for our single solution. That's simply not going to work. So there's some things that you will need to decide at a higher level. But just because you decided at a higher level doesn't mean you can't include people that are working with it. So enterprise architects, if they need to pick a cloud solution to go, I would always try to include people from various parts of the organization, system architects and people from the agile teams. They'll feel included in the discussion. They'll feel that the decision they have made is now also on them. That will get them more motivated to actually do this. So inclusion to get alignment here is absolutely essential. I've seen that work very well in the 2 greenfield projects I worked in, where the system architect was very busy with looking at the architecture. So he led 2 of the application architects from the agile teams go to courses in this new architecture. They were setting up an education program for the entire art because they needed to move to the new technology. So they were actually cross-training all of the engineers within the agile release trains, and sometimes even with the system architect attending that. So he decentralized that information to them, and they told him, what's the program. So you can get this working quite well if you just get those people to collaborate.
Yeah, I think that's a nice way of sort of doing it, and it's a pattern that encourages growth within the teams. It should be encouraged that people are learning skills around architecture and whatever else might be the case. And I think it also highlights the fact that agile teams are cross-functional. They have software engineers and testers, but also architects. That is a skill that is necessary and desirable for the individual teams to have. What about the sort of question about teams sharing information with each other? What sort of role do you see for the architecture at all the different levels in facilitating maybe the sort of teams within the Agile release train to share information with each other and to maybe agree on new approaches and other sort of technical standards? Have you seen any sort of patterns that work well for that?
Yeah. So again, like I mentioned, communities of practice, an excellent spot, because the beautiful thing about the communities of practice is everybody's welcome. So you can have somebody who's the core people who are really the tech-savvy architecture nerds, but you can get testers in there. Testers will benefit from understanding the architecture as well. You can have developers in there. You can have business analysts in there who will also benefit from this. It's open for people to join. So that works quite well. On the other end, I really like when we're having the system demos, that you system demo your architectures as well, and the learnings and findings that you get. It's an excellent opportunity. It doesn't have to be a long speech, but if you have some new capability within your architecture, share it in the system demo, share it with the rest of the art, maybe even sharing it with the business owners who are expecting to have this architecture. Well, maybe they don't care about the architecture, but they certainly care about the features that's coming on top of it. So being able to showcase what we can now do with these enablers is going to help you moving forward.
Yeah, it sounds great. And as you say, that's just going to increase the motivation of the team if they feel there's opportunity to develop skills. And across a big structure like an agile release train with hundreds of people, if people feel that they're able to sort of develop and move, and of course people have aspirations. If you're a BA today, maybe you're interested in becoming a software engineer, or maybe even vice versa. And I think that's those sorts of communities of practice really sort of make it a good place to work, don't they? They make it a place that people want to work and want to be a part of, and that's only going to have a positive effect on productivity, creativity, innovation, and all the things that are going to sort of lead to better products at the end of the day.
So I can tell we're telling all these great stories. I'm going to tell a not so great story as well. We need all these different learnings. So I've also been in organizations where the architects felt they didn't belong within the arts. They want to sit on the side doing the architecture, and the unfortunate thing I saw from this is that your architecture and the direction the art is taking is actually growing apart. So you'll have somebody thinking really, really great ideas, but nobody's willing to use them. So whether you actually physically put your architects within an art, maybe that's not possible, but at least make sure that you have some kind of cadence so you actually tie them together with the direction they're taking. So having a system architect, inviting them in, having them part of your PI planning, having them part of your system demos, be able to give feedback, don't alienate them. We're going to need them. They understand the entire infrastructure. Just letting them sit by themselves is not going to solve the problem. It's not going to help your agile transformation.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Good. Okay. Well, should we see if there are any questions? This is the final sort of question session. So really anything at all from the sort of webinar as a whole, certainly relating to that topic there, but any other questions that you have, doesn't even have to be topic specific. If you have any sort of safe questions for me and Rune, just feel free to pile in now. Jess, do we have anything in the Q&A so far?
We've got one at the moment. So what are risks generally seen and how are risks managed?
Yes. How does risk sort of fit into the picture? I think sometimes people think that agile is not about risk. Risk is confined to traditional project management and having a risk register. But I don't know about you, Rune, but I think nothing could be further from the truth. I think risk is a pretty sort of central part and essential parts of managing sort of work effectively, especially at large scales. How have you seen risks managed in your experience?
Yeah, so I agree with you. Risk and innovation go hand in hand. You can't have one without the other. And there's really 2 ways to address this, because you'll see many enterprises having this zero failure culture, and you really want to get away from that, because thinking there's only one solution to your problems, we know that's not the case. We want to have innovation, we want to use design sets and different approaches to doing it, and that drives risks. That drives risk because we've got to explore this. So again, the low practical way that we do this in SAFe, we roam the risk during our PI planning, but what do you do with it afterwards? So when I was working as an RTE, what I usually did was I took my big Roam board. I organized all of my risk actually into the different iterations, so I know when do we actually anticipate this is going to happen. And then each and every time I either had our SOS or our art sync, I'll go through my PI objectives and I'll go through my risks. And I'll look, what are we anticipating could happen in this iteration? What can we anticipate happening in the next? Can we do some mitigation plans? Do we have somebody who has ownership on this, is working on that? So I'll use it articulated at every single SOS, just to make sure, have anything changed? Has this come into place? Has this been eliminated? Making it a completely normal part of you reviewing the progress of the art. And of course, if you're having some really major risk, well, you want to make sure to maybe do a little bit more due diligence, what's impacting and so on. So you can certainly use some of the risk management principles for managing this risk as well. And just making sure that just because you have them on PI planning, well, you need to follow up on them. They don't just disappear.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I think, as you say, making them visible, making them part of the process is key. Part of the question as well was around the types of risks. What kinds of risks might be seen. I guess when I sort of think about risks in IT, I kind of categorize it in two broad categories, and then there's a whole bunch of stuff underneath. I guess in general, there's first of all requirements risk. There's the risk that you're building the wrong thing, that you misinterpreted the acceptance criteria. There's the risk that when you actually release it, nobody will care or be interested, or the risk, I guess there's a requirement, the idea that you might create reputational damage even in the requirements. You built something, you thought it would be a good idea, the market responds negatively. So there's always that risk. I have some requirements, I don't know for sure if they're the right requirements. So anything new, anything novel, and I guess maybe dependencies might be part of that as well. If there are requirements across multiple teams, that might sort of fit into that sort of category as well. And then as a secondary bucket of risk, you've got technology. Anything at all to do with what might happen when you actually come to integrate things together or test them or run them in the production environments. Anything to do with the uncertainties about how to implement a feature or a requirement. And I think in both of those categories, the thing to do is to capture those risks in the items at whatever level they are, whether they're stories or features or whatever it is that you're sort of doing, and then sort of feed that into your ordering. So if there is a risk that a customer won't, you've got a requirement, there's the risk that the customer won't want it quite like that, or that the sort of new field might not be in the way that they want it, probably better to do that requirement earlier on, so that if it becomes an issue, you've still got time to deal with it. And similarly with the technology, a lot of the sort of technical approaches in SAFe, centering around the continuous delivery pipeline, DevOps practices, are all sort of geared up to not leaving those big technical risks right until the end. So not, having a big systems integration test after 12 months of effort, then realizing that your architecture is fundamentally flawed, trying to de-risk it by sort of taking a better sort of technology approach, sort of building the sort of capability to mitigate those risks earlier on in the process. Good. Anyway, that's enough about that. So, Jess, do we have any more questions to sort of get through?
Yeah, we do. So, as a delivery manager, what training is the best way to start my SAFe journey?
Good question. Yeah. What do you think? Yeah.
Okay, so without knowing the context, I'm going to suggest two things. First of all, I would say that probably our most popular all-round get the best understanding of SAFe within a reasonable time is by far the leading SAFe course. That's going to take you through all of the principles, all of the background, talking about lean, talking about agile, talking about how we actually execute, going into the portfolio. In a 2-day course.
I think I'd agree with that. It sounds like you got a second part to your answer. Just in the meantime, Jess, do you want to just get a link to that leading SAFe training course into the chat so that they can sort of find their way to that training?
Yeah, we'll do for the leading SAFe one.
Yeah, so that'll appear in the chat in a few moments. And Rune, it sounds like you had a follow-on.
A different one because I just noticed the word delivery manager here. And just 1.5 weeks ago, I had 25 people in an implementing class, and those were predominantly delivery managers actually responsible for the delivering across the organization. So that's the SPC course. That's our most advanced state-of-the-art class for 4 days that will not only give you deep insight into the entire framework, but it will also, once you certify, enable you to actually go and train the courses within your organization. That is the masterclass of them all. But I mean, it really depends on your context. Are you just learning to look for it, or has your company actually started transforming? So that's where, knowing a bit context, those are the two classes I would look into.
Yeah, I think I'd agree with that. I think the question sort of says, what's the best way to start my SAFe journey? So I think on that sort of context, probably the first one, leading SAFe, would be as you say, it's the sort of the flagship course. It's the sort of course that, you know, if you want to know what SAFe is all about, whether you're a manager, a leader, or even a member of the team, and if SAFe is coming and you want to know about it, it's probably the one that covers most of the sort of stuff that you need to know. And thank you, Jess. The link is there in the chat. What do we have next? Any other questions, Jess?
We do. What are other report management's report for SAFe overall, and who needs to provide them?
Oh, that's a lovely question. So let me start by saying that when you transition to an agile way of working, and in our case we're talking about SAFe, you will need to change some of the reports. Some of the reports you had previously, well, they're not going to help you anymore. Having reports focusing on phase gates and waterfall procedures, those kind of things are no longer valid. And actually they are counterproductive to a transformation because you're measuring the wrong thing. So what could you measure? I'm not going to list all, 30 of them we have on the framework. So if you want to go into detail, reading about it, on the big picture, on the right side in what we call the spanning palette, there's an icon called metrics. So if you want to read about them all, you can read there. The ones I strongly suggest that you look at if you're talking about agile release train level, the king metric is predictability. The ability for the art to consistently deliver value predictably. That is the king metric, because that's really what's gaining us the trust and our ability to exist, that we actually deliver on our promises. So that one by far. Which other can you apply? And there's a multitude of others, also depending on your maturity. So do you want to measure what is my lead time from you get your idea about the features until you actually deliver it? That could be one. If you are, again, we're looking at technical depth, maybe you want to measure your production defects because they're related to that. Could be some other things. So there's a ton of them. Predictability, that's the one I'm going to suggest by far, and then the rest will probably depend on your context.
Good stuff. Good. I've got a few more questions in the chat. Let's take one each for the next few then, Rune. Jess, what's the next one?
The next one is how to align velocity between different teams.
Yeah, interesting. So I guess if you have, an agile release train comprising, sort of several teams, there might be this desire to have every team have a similar velocity. If one team has a velocity of 100, another has a velocity of 10, does that mean that second team is doing, a tenth of the work? I think a practical note here is that if you're sizing work, it needs to be sized by the people that are going to be doing the work. So when it comes to SAFe, we have features broken down into stories. I think, certainly, good practice that I've sort of seen would be that you will have some notion of which team is going to get which feature. I think, that's part of, good effective planning, and maybe there might be some last minute adjustments if necessary, but you can usually sort of get around those. But essentially, a team should know which features are coming its way, and they should therefore size those features or size the stories within those features in a way that is consistent to them. What you really want when you go into PI planning is for each team to be able to relatively predictably, as Rune says, with about 80% predictability, have the sort of tools and ability to say, this is what we think we can do over the program increment. So actually, I would say, and so other people would disagree, but I would say that you shouldn't be trying to align velocity between different teams. What you should be trying to do is to have each team have a consistent and predictable way of giving a pretty good forecast. I think 80% predictability is, I'd call that, industry sort of leading. If you could have that, you'd be a very happy product manager or a very happy sponsor. So try not to worry too much if you have differences in velocity across different teams. Just try to concentrate on having each team able to effectively estimate their work.
Yeah, I'll add a small thing in here without going into too much. At least you want to align your scales. So, I mean, you probably can't have one team working in Fibonacci scales and the other one working in jelly beans. You know, that's not going to work. We're working together as an art trying to align. So at least your scales need to be the same.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Good. What's the next question, Jess?
Okay, so my organization are considering different scaling frameworks. What makes SAFe better than the others?
Ah, perfect for you, Rune.
You know what? Yesterday, when I was sitting and preparing for this, I was fearing this question was going to come. I was trying to prepare a good answer for it. So I'm an expert in SAFe. I am not an expert in less. I am not an expert in Scrum at Scale. I've heard about them. I've read a bit about them. I think I'll defer that answer to you. That's really not me.
Well, I guess if I were to answer that question, I'd say, well, what is your organization hoping to deliver? Have a look at SAFe, have a look at less, have a look at your own bespoke scaled solution. You know, that can work well in sort of different sort of situations too. I guess one thing I would say in support of SAFe is that it's not as prescriptive as some people would assume. You know, if you see the big picture, it's a big, thing. You might assume that, if you do SAFe, you've got to do all of the sort of thing all at once as some big cookie cutter approach. One of the reasons that we as Agility and Mind are attracted to SAFe is that it's actually pretty pragmatic. I sometimes describe SAFe as a collection of 20 years of agile good practice packaged up in a way that is in a big picture, that is sort of describable and explainable to sort of people. But actually within those sort of constraints, there is quite a lot of leeway. There's quite a lot of flexibility. You don't have to do every single element on the big picture. Like Rune, I don't actually have a huge amount of experience in less or Scrum at Scale either. But when we were sort of choosing a framework to work with for our clients, I think those are the sort of things that attracted us to SAFe. And I think the other thing to say is that it is doing the best job in terms of getting traction in the market. So there is that benefit in terms of if you're hiring people or if you're bringing people into your organization, it's doing the sort of thing that maybe Scrum did 20 years ago of being the one that most people are familiar with. So I think, as one slight nudge of an advantage is that it's probably the one that people are most familiar with. And that can help, having consistency if you're sort of bringing people in or understanding what's going on. I think that can also be an advantage. Good. Okay. What else do we have, Jess?
Last one in the Q&A is, can Kanban teams migrate to SAFe, or is it only suitable for Scrum teams?
Interesting. Do you want to crack at that one, Rune?
Yeah. So I'll elaborate on that one as well. So in SAFe, we love Kanban and we love Scrum. And actually, we love pretty much all of the different agile approaches on team level. I had a co-instructor here the other week when we were teaching an SPC class, talking about a number of other team level frameworks to use. So can we use that? Absolutely. So we have Kanban and Scrum in there, used predominantly. There are some small variations that we need to put in place because we want to ensure that we have cadence and synchronizations across our teams within our arts. So maybe some of them have a bit of a twist on how to do it, but you can absolutely use it. And we have a great article on how to use Kanban inside the framework. You could just go and look at the framework, find the little place where it says Kanban, click on it, and you'll get an article describing that. So absolutely not a problem.
Yeah, great stuff. I guess maybe a sort of deeper question there might be, what exactly is the team doing? So can all Scrum teams migrate to SAFe? Almost certainly. I can't imagine a Scrum team that couldn't migrate to SAFe if it was big enough. Obviously, one of the constraints is, do you need to scale? If there's just one Scrum team, then maybe the answer is no. But if you have many Scrum teams and you want to sort of scale up, then I can't imagine a scenario where SAFe wouldn't work. Whereas Kanban is much more broad. Kanban is not limited to software product delivery. You can run a Kanban team for managing a local restaurant, or running your sort of local sort of specialist sort of cleaning services. You can apply Kanban to any situation at all where value is being delivered, and you want to map out the process and improve the process gradually over time. So I guess that would be the sort of real question: is the application suitable for a framework which is designed to deliver large-scale products where multiple teams need to coordinate their activities and sort of do those sorts of things? Yeah. Good. Okay. Well, it looks like that's all of the questions in the Q&A. If you have any sort of burning sort of questions, there's probably another minute or so just to sort of get it in just before we wrap up. But last thing to say really is just thank you very much for listening. It's great to have some sort of good sort of attendance here, and it's great to see the consistency. Very, very few people dropped out, so we must have been doing something right, Rune. And thank you, Rune, for joining us for this session. I really enjoyed our discussion and sort of hearing your insights. For the delegates, for the attendees, you'll get a bit of a follow-up email from Agility in Mind. There'll be a sort of survey in that sort of form. We really appreciate just a little bit of feedback from this session. Obviously, we've sort of provided this this sort of free experience. The payoff then is just a little bit of feedback from yourselves. That will sort of help us to run future sessions and to pitch it at the right sort of levels, do the right sort of topics. So that would very much be appreciated. And all that remains to say is thank you very much once again to Rune and to all of the delegates that have attended. And Jess, thank you for reading out the questions and keeping us on track of this hour and a half. And I very much look forward to seeing everybody here in future sessions.